So let's go back to the blue and orange pieces of paper. Under my assumption that the underlying green bonds are statistically independent, this is what the probability table looks like. And without any correlation among the defaults, in fact, the pricing that I just described, 990 for the blue bond and 810 for the orange bond, that's correct. But what if the defaults become highly correlated? In fact, what if they become perfectly correlated? Now, why should that happen? I mean, I'm assuming they're independent. Why could that change over time? And the answer has to do with this graph here. You see, when markets are going up, when US residential real estate is going up nationwide, default rates from one county to the next have nothing to do with each other. Defaults in Stockton, California have nothing to do with defaults in Reno, Nevada, have nothing to do with defaults in Allston, Massachusetts. They're just different, and local economies go up and down, but on a national level, the correlation across these different localities should average out. The problem is that on the way down, you get a different story. So this graph here that sort of looks like the beginning of a roller coaster ride, it actually was a roller coaster ride. And you know when you hit that crest and you start turning down, there's a lot of screaming and pain on the way down. Sorry, I think that was the last sound effect. When you have that situation where defaults start happening because housing is going down nationally, then things change. So in this case, if all of these green pieces of paper are perfectly correlated, you don't have 3 different states of the world, you have 2. They both pay or they both default. And now, if you only have 2 possibilities, 90 and 10, as we know, the correct prices of these bonds should be both 900. The priority doesn't actually give you any value. Either both bonds default or they both pay. And that means that the values of these bonds are the same, $900. Why is that a bad thing? Well, think about what that means. You, the AAA tranche holder, the money market fund, you bought a bond for $990, and now the bond is worth $900. That's not good. You just lost 10% of your value. Now, 10% loss is not a big deal if you're investing in equities like the S&P 500. It's bad, but it's not going to put you out of business. If you're a money market fund and you're expecting the principal never to lose value, that's devastating. Thank God you have insurance. Well, we know what happened there. Everybody started asking their insurance companies to pay. And because this wasn't really insurance, because it was done in the form of credit default swaps, not enough was set aside. And as a result, the insurers began to fail. And the only people that made money in this were who? Who made money? Hedge funds, because they paid $810 and now their bonds are worth $900. All because correlations changed. Correlations, they changed. And you know what the most subtle and frustrating thing about all of this? Correlation is not a parameter that you can look up in the Wall Street Journal. There's no column that says, oh, this is the correlation for these bonds as of today. It's not something that people are focusing on. Now, you know, in defense of the risk manager, they actually modeled correlations among mortgages. And they said, let's take a look at the history. The last 50 years, let's look at the correlations among defaults. And I don't know what that was, but let's say it was 1%. Okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to triple that. And we're going to assume that it's 3%. And still, they were able to withstand that shock, never expecting that the housing market would go down the way it did nationally. Because in the 50 years of data prior, that US residential real estate did not go down on a national level. So this is how the banking sector got in trouble. This is a typical bank that's well capitalized. It's got leverage of 10 to 1, 10% capital ratio. But it's got the AAA tranches long, and it's got the below investment grade tranches short. So it's got these assets on its balance sheet. It's got the below investment grade on its liabilities. And over time, as they lost money on the AAA tranches, that deteriorated their equity. And as they lost even more money on the short positions in their BA tranches, they lost even more money, and they got the equity wiped out. And ultimately, because these markets then froze and people couldn't value these bonds, there was no liquidity, banks didn't know exactly what was on their balance sheets, and they were stuck and ultimately caused the financial crisis. Someone said that the problem is that because there was nothing right with the left side of the balance sheet, pretty soon there was nothing left on the right side of the balance sheet. So remember that for the future. So that's the financial crisis in a nutshell, and it was a terribly devastating event that we're still dealing with in terms of repercussions here in Europe and also in Asia. So why on earth would we want to do this again for biomedical innovation? And this now will take me to the main topic today, which is the work that I did jointly with Jose Maria Fernandez, at the time Sloan Fellow here, and Roger Stein, who at the time was at Moody's as head of their analytics division.